The Callahan mansion was a monument to wealth and dominance. Its wide verandas, polished marble floors, and endless acres of land spoke of prosperity. Yet behind its walls, something unspeakable thrived. The family presented themselves as pillars of the community, generous patrons of the church and employers of countless workers. Their name carried weight in every corner of Blackwood County. But in truth, their estate was a fortress of cruelty. Jacob Callahan, the patriarch, wielded charm like a weapon. His handshake was firm, his smile disarming, but his eyes betrayed the cold calculation of a man who saw human lives as mere tools to expand his empire. His wife Eleanor stood as the perfect hostess, her delicate features and graceful manners masking a heart as ruthless as her husband. Together they built a dynasty that fed on silence and fear. At gatherings, the Callahans welcomed neighbors with wine and music, the air filled with laughter. While only a few feet above their guests, the attic groaned under the weight of caged children, their muffled cries drowned out by the clinking of glasses and the hum of polite conversation. The servants knew. Of course, they always knew, but they also knew what happened to anyone who spoke too loudly about Callahan affairs. Some disappeared overnight. Others were found in ditches, branded as thieves or drunks. Their fates a warning to the rest. Silence was survival. Loyalty was survival. The town itself turned a blind eye. Prosperity flowed from the Callahan businesses, lumber mills, coal operations, and vast farms, all thriving under the Callahan brand. Fathers worked for them. Mothers cleaned their halls. Children attended schools, built with Callahan donations. And when whispers surfaced about missing orphans or strange activity on the estate, most dismissed them as jealous gossip. After all, who would dare accuse the family that paid their wages and held their future in the palm of their hand? But deep within the mansion there was no laughter, no grace, no civility, only cages and shadows, only the sound of small fists tapping against iron bars and the quiet sobs of children robbed of sunlight. This was the secret that powered the Callahan dynasty, the rot behind the polished veneer. There are secrets carved into the bones of history, secrets whispered in blood and silence, secrets that were never meant for your ears yet. Tonight you will hear them all, and once you do, there will be no going back. The Callahan mansion in Blackwood County, Kentucky, looked like a monument to Southern prosperity, its brick walls glowing warm under the torchlight of 1853, its windows reflecting the power of a family who appeared to have everything: wealth, land, respect, influence. But beneath the fine dinners and polished floors, there was an attic, a place no guest was ever allowed to enter. And inside that attic, 39 children were hidden away like livestock, iron cages stacked like crates. Their cries muffled by the laughter of banquets below. The world saw the Callahans as pillars of the community, but every empire built on lies demands silence, blood, and obedience. You must understand this was not only about one family, it was about power, about how those who rule bend morality to their will, about how entire towns can be turned into accomplices simply by choosing not to look up at the locked windows of a grand house. It begins with whispers. It always begins with whispers. A schoolteacher noticing a child who looks too tired for her age. A neighbor hearing scratching sounds in the night and telling himself it must be rats. A traveler from Boston finding papers that should not exist. These small moments are the cracks where the truth bleeds through. And the Callahans spent years cementing over those cracks, bribing officials, silencing witnesses, burying secrets in shallow graves behind the slave quarters. Their greatest weapon was not the cages or the chains. It was indifference. Because when a town convinces itself that suffering does not matter, then monsters are free to walk in daylight. What you are about to hear is not only the story of cruelty, but of revelation, a descent into forbidden knowledge. Here each layer stripped away reveals a deeper rot. Listen carefully, let these words reach into you, because once you begin to see, you will never be able to unsee. The attic itself was a world apart, hidden by locked doors and narrow staircases that few dared to climb in that suffocating space. Rows of wooden cages lined the walls, each no larger than a coffin, bars crudely hammered together and reinforced with rusted locks. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and mildew. Sunlight never touched this place, only the dim glow of oil lamps flickering against damp beams. The children kept. They were stripped not only of freedom, but of names reduced to numbers, scratched into the wood above their cages. Their voices had grown hoarse from crying until silence became the only way to endure. For the Callahans, the attic was not merely a prison, it was a resource, a place where vulnerable lives could be stored like commodities waiting to be distributed to distant properties. Some were sent to labor in mines, their small bodies forced into tunnels too narrow for grown men. Others disappeared into the sprawling lumber camps where their hands bled from splinters and their backs bent beneath loads far too heavy for their fragile frames. Many never returned. Those who did bore scars, both visible and hidden. Yet within this cruelty, there were fragments of resistance. The children shared, whispered lullabies, taught each other how to scratch messages into the wood with hidden nails, and clung to tiny tokens smuggled past the guards. A ribbon, a button, a pebble from the yard below. Even in the darkest cage, hope flickered like the flame of a candle, though the Callahans believed they had crushed it completely, but the walls of the attic remembered the truth. The scratches, the stains, the faint echoes of names long erased. These remnants would one day outlast the family that built the prison. They believed no one would ever uncover what they had done. No one would dare climb the stairs and see. Yet history has a way of dragging secrets into the light. The Callahan family did not rise to power by chance. Their influence was woven into every corner of Blackwood County, from the sheriff who signed false reports to the judges who owed their positions to Callahan funding. Jacob Callahan in particular understood that wealth was not measured only in land or gold, but in silence. He bought it with bribes, he enforced it with fear, and he cultivated it by binding others to him through favors and debts. Farmers who worked his fields knew to look away when wagons passed in the night. Tradesmen who sold to the estate ignored the faint cries that slipped from beneath the tarps, and the clergy who preached. Each Sunday spoke of charity and faith while dining on the Callahan table during the week. Even newspapers across Kentucky published flattering accounts of Jacob's generosity, never once daring to question how his fortunes had grown so vast so quickly. The true genius of the Callahans lay in how they weaponized legitimacy. Every document appeared lawful. Every apprenticeship certificate bore the proper seals. Every ledger was neatly balanced. The cruelty of their empire was hidden, not in shadows but in plain sight, cloaked in bureaucracy and ritual. Those who did question quietly disappeared, like Thomas Reynolds. Their stories rewritten, their deaths attributed to accident or misfortune, while the machine of exploitation churned on unchallenged. And yet beneath the polished veneer, there was always a crack. The family lived in constant vigilance, guarding secrets that threatened to devour them. Whispers spread among servants about what lay in the attic, and travelers who lodged nearby reported hearing strange noises in the night. Jacob himself forbade certain doors from ever being opened, even by his kin, and William Callahan was said to carry the keys upon his body at all times, as if unlocking them meant unlocking damnation itself. The town may have net its face, but fear is not the same as ignorance. Deep down, many knew something terrible lived within the walls of that estate. They chose to bury it because acknowledging it meant facing their own complicity, and so the Callahans thrived under the cover of willful blindness, a dynasty built not only on cruelty, but on the silence of an entire community. By the spring of 1854, the silence that shielded the Callahans began to fracture. When Edward Bennett arrived under the guise of a journalist, he carried with him not only the fragments of Thomas Reynolds' notebook, but also a cautious resolve. Unlike Thomas, he did not rush toward confrontation. He observed, he listened. He played the role of an admirer, while quietly mapping the shadows where truth might be hiding. He saw the children, though not directly, their figures small and frail, moving between stacks of lumber or darting across the edges of mining camps. Jacob Callahan brushed them off as apprentices learning a trade. But Edward noted the way they never spoke, never looked up, and never lingered near adults unless ordered to. He saw the attic too. Its windows suspiciously new, its boards too fresh, as though years of hidden cruelty had been covered in a matter of days, but not erased. Charlotte Bennett. His cousin worked in silence beside him, her place as a teacher, granting her access to stories from innocent mouths, children who spoke of wagons in the night, or of friends who vanished after being sent to the estate. She gathered these fragments carefully, never alarming the townsfolk, never drawing suspicion. Her courage was not loud, it was subtle, it was patient. It was the kind of courage that keeps breathing, even when danger is everywhere. Together they began to see the pattern. The system was vast. Children were pulled from orphanages, through false papers handed over by officials too greedy to care, then transported like livestock across Kentucky and Tennessee, worked until they broke and discarded when they no longer served profit. This was no mere family vice. This was an industry, a machine of flesh and fear, polished into legitimacy by the Callahans' unshakable grip on power. Edward knew that what he uncovered could not be contained within county lines. If he confronted the Callahans direct, he would meet the same fate as Thomas Reynolds. But if he gathered enough evidence, if he struck with precision, the machine could be torn apart from its very core. And for the first time since the attic had been filled with cages, the Callahan dynasty felt a tremor beneath its foundation, a tremor that whispered of exposure and reckoning. Edward Bennett understood that to strike at the Callahans he would need allies beyond the reach of their money and threats. So he carried the fragments of Thomas Reynolds' notebook to Louisville, where he sought out a federal marshal known not for wealth or politics, but for incorruptibility, Daniel Hartford, a man whose loyalty was to law, not family, and whose reputation for unyielding resolve made him feared by criminals across the South. Hartford listened in silence as Edward laid out the evidence. The children's names scrawled in a trembling hand, the sketches of cages, the testimonies from former servants, and the whispered memories of Charlotte's students. Each piece on its own was fragile, but together they formed a chain of horror that could not be dismissed. Hartford's eyes hardened, and for the first time the crimes of the Callahans were no longer the whispers of the powerless, but the subject of a federal investigation. By early spring of 1854, Hartford assembled a team of deputies, men chosen for their grit and their distance from Kentucky's corruption. They did not march to the Callahan estate directly, for Hartford knew the family's influence would alert them before he reached the gates. Instead, they struck the shadows first, riding to remote mining camps and lumber mills where the Callahan empire stretched beyond the eyes of polite society. What they found there stripped away every doubt. 12 children, malnourished and scarred, locked in a shed until morning, when they would be dragged to the mines like beasts of burden. Their overseer tried to flee but was caught, and under the weight of his own crimes, he broke spilling secrets about the wider network. He spoke of wagons carrying children across state lines, of officials bribed with gold, and land of ledgers filled with numbers that were not profits, but bodies. With this discovery, Hartford moved swiftly, securing warrants to search free Callahan property. What began as whispers was now a storm sweeping across Blackwood County. Jacob and William Callahan, sensing the noose tightening, tried to flee, but even wealth could not buy them speed. They were dragged from a railway station 20 miles from their estate, their faces pale, not with fear of law, but with fear of truth, for they knew that once exposed the empire they had built on silence, and blood would crumble into dust. When Hartford and his men entered the Callahan estate, the grand facade of the mansion seemed to sneer at them, its polished marble floors and glittering chandeliers, a mockery of the filth and cruelty hidden beneath. Within those walls, servants trembled, but said nothing. Eleanor Callahan and Miss Winters stood in cold defiance, denying every accusation, even as evidence whispered from every corner of the house. The attic had been scrubbed, the cages dismantled, the ledgers burned, yet shadows leave scars where light cannot reach. Investigators found scratch marks carved deep into the wood where iron bars had once been bolted. They found a child's shoe wedged behind a trunk, too small to belong to any servant. They found a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard, A desperate concealment that Eleanor had overlooked inside lay the secondary ledgers, each page heavy with the weight of stolen lives, numbers of children bought, sold, worked until they vanished. As deputies carried these ledgers down the staircase, the illusion of Callahan honor shattered in the daylight. Those papers were not mere accounts. They were confessions, signed in silence by the victims who could not speak. Still, the mansion echoed with more than evidence. For some deputies swore they heard faint cries as they pried open panels in the attic, whimpers too soft to be explained by wind. One man dropped his lantern and refused to climb higher, certain he had felt a small hand grip his wrist from the darkness. Though no one was there, children rescued from remote Callahan properties now gave voice to what the walls could not. They spoke of being taken from orphanages with forged documents of being locked in cages while the family dined below of Miss Winter's cruel hand and Jacob Callahan's calculating gaze. They spoke of nights filled with hunger, of mornings filled with labor, and of the attic that became both prison and grave for those who did not survive. The testimony was damning, the ledgers undeniable, the mansion itself a witness against its masters for the Callahans. There would be no return to society. No mask of wealth could hide the filth beneath. The truth was free at last, and like rot breaking through polished wood, it spread through the county, leaving no heart untouched. The courthouse overflowed with bodies eager to witness the collapse of a dynasty, men in polished boots and women in lace bonnets pressed against the walls, while children peeked between railings to glimpse the once untouchable Callahans dragged into judgment. Jacob, William, and Eleanor sat rigid, their fine clothes failing to mask the stench of guilt. The air itself seemed charged heavy with years of secrets clawing to the surface. The prosecution laid bare the ledgers, the testimonies, and the scars, carved into the bodies of rescued children. The words cut through the silence like knives. Every witness peeled away the mask of respectability that had shielded the Callahans for decades. Overseers spoke of orders given by William to work the children until collapse. Servants whispered of Eleanor's cold commands, and Miss Winter's face hardened, as child after child pointed to her as the hand that delivered beatings in the dark attic. For days the trial ground on every detail, another wound upon the family's name. Some jurors turned pale at the descriptions of cages of children left in filth for days with nothing but scraps to eat, of little bodies carried out under moonlight. When they no longer drew breath, the judge's gavel could barely contain the outrage swelling in the room as the truth spilled unrelenting. The defense fought with money and influence, claiming exaggeration, claiming fabrications, yet wealth held no weight against the testimonies of 39 broken voices united in pain. When the verdict came, it rang like a bell through Blackwood County. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Jacob, William, and Eleanor Callahan condemned alongside Miss Winters and the overseers who enforced their cruelty. The estate stood silent after the judgment, its windows shuttered, its halls hollow, a monument to the lie that power can bury atrocity. The townsfolk avoided its gates, whispering that the spirits of the children had not left, that their cries still haunted the attic, even after the law had spoken. In the end, no verdict, no punishment could cleanse the soil, soaked with the suffering of the forgotten. The Callahan estate, once a beacon of wealth and authority, now loomed like a carcass of rot and silence. Its columns cracked, its windows veiled in dust. No family dared claim it. No tenant stayed within its walls for long, because what had been done in its attic could not be scrubbed away. The neighbors said the land itself remembered the screams. Children in the town dared each other to step onto the property. After dusk, they whispered of ghostly rattling sounds of cage bars in the dark of night, of small fists pounding against wooden beams where no attic should exist. Farmers swore that when the wind carried from the east, they could hear cries drifting across the fields, faint yet sharp enough to freeze their blood, and always the sound came from above. Where the attic had once been, the first buyers were wealthy men from the north, hoping to prove the rumors were nonsense. They brought in furniture painters and servants. Yet within weeks, every one of them abandoned the mansion. Some complained of scratches on the walls that appeared overnight, others of footsteps pacing above their bedrooms. though the staircase to the attic had long been sealed. One man awoke screaming, swearing. He had seen pale hands reaching from beneath the floorboards to drag him under. Decades passed and the mansion decayed. But the legend only grew. Children born generations after the Callahans' downfall knew the stories of cages in the attic of 39 children who never found rest, of teachers who warned their students never to wander near the property. Yet still the mansion pulled at the imagination like a wound that never healed. By the turn of the century, the Callahan name was no longer spoken in public, yet the estate remained a scar on Blackwood County, a place avoided yet never forgotten. For in its silence was the echo of truth. Power had sought to bury, but never could. And so the land stood cursed, not by spee, irits alone, but by memory itself, a reminder that cruelty festers when unchecked, and that some sins rot into the soil forever. By the early 1900s, the Callahan mansion had become more than a ruin. It was a shrine of fear, its boarded windows and leaning chimneys casting long shadows across the county. The townsfolk would not speak of it openly, but whispers traveled in hushed tones through taverns and schoolyards. People claimed that lights flickered in the upper windows, even though no one lived there. That the sound of children weeping carried into the night air, and that those who entered rarely left unchanged. The county records showed failed attempts to repurpose the landmen. With ambition, tried to turn the property into farms, factories, and boarding schools, yet each endeavor ended in disaster. A barn burned without cause, livestock vanished from fenced fields. Workmen reported hearing laughter echoing from the rafters when no one was present. One foreman swore he found tiny handprints pressed into the plaster walls still wet. Though the room had been abandoned for 50 years, superstitious or not, the people of Blackwood County began to treat the estate as cursed. Some carried charms when passing its gates. Others crossed themselves or quickened their step. Children were told never to look at the house after dark, for fear the lost souls within would mark them as their own. The mansion became a symbol of what happens when evil is permitted to thrive under the veil of respectability, yet not all avoided it entirely. A darker fascination grew among outsiders who came to Kentucky after hearing of the Callahan legend. Occultists, spiritualists, and thrill-seekers all found their way to the gates, some seeking contact with the children who perished, others hoping to draw upon the residual power of suffering that seemed to saturate the grounds, and many of these strangers were never seen again. Their wagons left behind their names erased into rumor, and so the Callahan legacy did not end with the trial, nor with the ruin of their house. It lived on in the whispers and the haunted silence of the attic that was supposed to have been sealed away forever. Every generation retold the story, reshaping it, but always at its heart remained the same truth, that power unchecked can twist into monstrosity, and that cruelty once rooted in stone does not die with those who carried it out. As the decades slipped into the modern age, the Callahan house refused to surrender its grip on the human imagination. Its rotting timbers and collapsing roof were less a ruin than a scar etched into the land, and scars never fade. They only deepen beneath the skin. By the 1950s, urban legends had given way to something more unsettling. University researchers and folklorists began to arrive, framing the story, not as myth, but as a record of generational trauma and hidden ritual. One researcher, a professor from Ohio State, claimed the architecture of the attic was not accidental. He argued that the beams had been carved with markings resembling sigils from old European occult traditions, patterns meant to trap energy within a confined space. He noted how these patterns aligned perfectly with the positioning of the cages, suggesting that the attic itself had been designed not only to imprison, but to harvest the despair of children, turning suffering into something functional, into something transferable. This theory was dismissed publicly, yet privately. It circulated among circles fascinated with the darker currents of history. Whispers grew that the Callahans had been linked to secret societies operating in the shadows of 19th century America. Groups that believed pain could be converted into longevity, wealth, and influence. It was said that the patriarch of the family had close dealings with men in Washington, who later rose to prominence. Men whose faces still appear in dusty portraits that hang in halls of power. By the 1970s, the mansion had become a site of pilgrimage for those who practiced fringe spirituality. Reports of seances within its crumbling rooms spread through county records. Sheriff logs noted repeated trespassing incidents where groups entered chanting in languages the deputies did not understand. Candles and chalk circles were often left behind, along with strange metallic inns. Truman's whose purpose was never explained. One deputy reported seeing a childlike figure staring down from the attic window, yet no footprints were found inside. Through it all, the townsfolk kept their silence, because silence was safer to question the Callahans too deeply, was to court something that reached beyond history itself and into the marrow of reality. But the truth remained impossible to bury. Every document, every legend, every frightened recollection seemed to point to one undeniable conclusion. The Callahan attic had not simply been a chamber of cruelty. It had been a mechanism, a device, and it had left a residue that time could not wash away. By the late 20th century, the Callahan mansion was more ruin than home, yet government interest in the property never faded. Files that surfaced decades later through the Freedom of Information Act revealed that federal agents had visited the site multiple times between 1963 and 1981. The documents were heavily redacted, but fragments were enough to ignite suspicion. Terms like containment, anomalies, and non-replicable structures were scribbled in margins. The government was not there to protect the townsfolk. They were there to harvest what remained. One chilling record described a team entering the attic with specialized equipment, measuring electromagnetic surges that spiked only within the cages, as though the wood and iron carried a memory of agony itself. One agent wrote that the air became unbearably heavy, as though gravity itself had thickened, and several of the team vomited uncontrollably before abandoning their mission. Though the report denied supernatural causes, the final note suggested the attic be sealed and the site marked for further classified study. At the same time, whispers in the town grew louder, though no newspapers dared publish them. Locals claimed men in dark suits arrived at night, loading unmarked crates into trucks parked behind the decaying house. Some swore these crates contained portions of the floorboards and beams from the attic, as if pieces of the Callahan prison were being relocated to hidden facilities across the country for reasons no one dared ask questions about. By the 1990s, the mansion was officially condemned, yet demolitions were mysteriously postponed again and again. Each company contracted to tear it down, backed out citing unexplainable accidents, equipment, failures, fires that started from nowhere. The town began to believe the house itself was resisting its own erasure, like a living organism, refusing to be destroyed. A building that had so much human torment that it had become something more than wood and nails. And then came the rumors that the Callahan name itself had not vanished. Descendants scattered into new towns, new cities, changing spellings and reinventing histories, yet always holding positions of quiet influence. Bankers, politicians, judges, figures who lived in comfort while whispers followed them like shadows. The attic may have rotted, but its legacy had bled into the bloodstream of America itself. Legends persisted that the Callahan bloodline never abandoned the rituals of power that began in that cursed attic, though their mansion crumbled and their names were buried beneath layers of reinvention. Whispers claimed they still gathered in secret rooms, far from public eyes. No longer cages and whips, but contracts and handshakes cloaked in polished civility, yet serving the same hunger for control. Survivors who carried the trauma of the Callahan years into old age told their families that the children were not simply slaves of labor, but instruments in ceremonies, rites that no court transcript ever dared to record. These ceremonies were said to involve binding innocence to corruption, feeding fear into stone and timber, so that the walls themselves became alive with anguish. Whether this was superstition or fact remained unclear, but the idea that suffering could be weaponized traveled with the descendants. By the early 20th century, stories emerged of orphanages quietly linked to Callahan relatives' institutions, where adoption records disappeared and children simply stopped existing. These tales were dismissed as gossip, until one investigative reporter uncovered strange overlaps between missing child reports and properties held by shell companies tracing back to Callahan heirs. His article was suppressed. His career dismantled his notes, vanished from archives, leaving only fragments passed between those who still dared to ask questions. Even in modern times, townsfolk insisted the Callahan curse was alive. Some swore that judges with familiar features presided over trials where the poor never found justice. Others pointed to politicians whose names were different, yet whose eyes carried the same cold stare, etched into portraits that once hung in the Callahan estate. The suggestion was chilling, that the cages of the attic had not been dismantled, but merely evolved into invisible form. Prisons without bars constructed from poverty, fear, and silence. Those who researched too deeply into the family often described strange occurrences, machines failing when files were opened, photographs blurring, when portraits of descendants were scanned, voices captured in empty rooms saying, "Leave us alone." Investigators who ignored these warnings found their health failing or accidents befalling them. Patterns too precise to dismiss as coincidence. It was as if the attic itself had extended its reach across centuries, ensuring its legacy could never be fully uncovered. The deeper you descend into the story of the Callahans, the more it ceases to be a tale of one family and begins to reveal itself as a blueprint, a template of how power feeds on silence, and how cruelty flourishes when wrapped in wealth and respectability. The attic where 39 children were caged like animals was not merely a chamber of suffering. It was a prototype for control, a ritual space designed to test the limits of obedience and fear. Consider what those children represented. They were the voiceless, the forgotten, the kind who could disappear without consequence. In the eyes of society, they became the perfect raw material for an experiment in domination. And what the Callahans learned in their attic was simple, yet devastating. If you can erase the identity of one human being, you can erase the identity of an entire people. That principle carried forward into factories, sweatshops, and even institutions dressed in noble words like reform and education. It is not difficult to see how this seed grew into modern systems where invisible cages still hold the weak prisons filled with the poor, while the wealthy walk free. Corporate towers extracting labor from the desperate, while selling illusions of opportunity. Even our schools sometimes echo the attic conditioning obedience rather than awakening freedom, training children to conform rather than to question. If you look closely, you will see the same scratch marks, the same hidden compartments, the same shadows of cages hidden beneath the paint of progress. This is why the Callahan story is more than a horror of the past. It is a mirror. And when you stare into it, you are forced to ask yourself how many attics exist today, not in decaying mansions, but in gleaming skyscrapers, not in wooden cages, but in algorithms and contracts, not hidden in darkness, but standing in plain sight under the false light of legitimacy. The power that once ruled Frau. A single Kentucky estate now wears new faces, new uniforms, and new titles, but the hunger remains unchanged. You have walked with me through the corridors of history, and by now you should feel the weight pressing on your chest. The understanding that the Callahan attic was never just wood and nails, it was a design, a ritual of subjugation dressed as family discipline and business efficiency, and once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Think of how silence was bought in Blackwood County with favors, jobs, and threats. Think of how documents were altered, how officials looked away, how neighbors whispered, but chose not to act, and then think of your own world today, where powerful networks still thrive because people prefer comfort over confrontation. They say nothing when children vanish into systems, when labor is exploited, when lives are discarded, because to speak is dangerous. To remain silent is easier. This is the same pact that allowed the Callahans to reign for years. But here is the truth. They do not fear exposure nearly as much as they fear awakening. Because once one man truly sees the system for what it is, he cannot be controlled. He becomes untouchable. And that is why you were never meant to hear this story. That is why the attic is buried beneath false floorboards of history. Why names were erased. Why survivors were silenced. Yet here you are, still listening, still refusing to turn away, and that means something is changing. I want you to do something right now in the comments. Write the phrase, "I break the chains," and then write it again a second time. When you repeat it, you do more than feed an algorithm. You anchor your identity. You declare that you are not one of the blind, that you refuse to be a silent witness, that you are ready to stand among the few who see through the veil. And once you write it, you will never read history the same way again. The Callahan attic may seem like a grotesque relic of the past, but I will tell you this. The past never dies. It mutates. It wears new masks, and it hides behind institutions that claim to protect you while feeding on your compliance. The cages you saw in that attic did not disappear. They only changed shape today. They are built from paperwork, from laws, from technologies, designed not to liberate, but to monitor and restrain. Think carefully about how the Callahans worked. They gathered children through falsified documents. They bribed authorities. They cloaked their crimes in respectability and business. Those same tactics are at play now across the world. Governments, corporations, shadow networks. They all use legitimacy as their disguise. They know that if people see the uniform, the office, the seal of authority, they will not question what lies behind it. And that blindness is their shield. When you realize this, you begin to feel a shift inside you, a discomfort because you recognize that much of what you trusted was never real. It was scaffolding built to keep you docile. The Callahan family may have been put on trial, but the idea of the Callahan system lives on, and it thrives every time you accept without question. Every time you let yourself believe that suffering only happens somewhere else in another time, to someone weaker or less fortunate. But here is the law of power. They never stop. Once they taste control, they expand it until nothing remains outside their grasp. The Callahans tested their reach in a single county. But what if the same methods stretched across states, across nations, across the very fabric of modern life? What if the attic has simply grown large enough to surround us all, and the cages now stand invisible? So listen to me. You cannot leave this story as the same person who entered it. You have to choose whether you stay asleep in the comfort of illusions or awaken to a terrible but liberating truth that the world you inhabit is not built for your freedom, it is built for your obedience. And once you know that, once you see the bars, no matter how well disguised, you will never mistake captivity for safety again. Now we descend deeper, and you must understand this truth with no illusions. The cages that surrounded the children in the Callahan attic were made of iron and wood, but the cages around you are woven from thought, belief, and consent. The most dangerous prisons are not those built with bars. They are the ones built with ideas whispered into your mind since birth, convincing you that obedience is virtue and rebellion is sin. Think of it like this. When the Callahans bribed the sheriff and silenced the courts, they were not just buying protection, they were buying perception. They ensured that the community believed the Callahans were untouchable, respectable pillars of society, while in secret they fed on the weak today. The same dynamic rules your world, the corporations, the governments, the unseen networks of wealth. They do not need to chain your body when they already chain your will. They feed you narratives of security, of progress, of freedom, while erasing the evidence of what it truly costs behind every smiling figure of authority. There may be a ledger like the one hidden beneath the Callahan floorboards. A ledger written not in ink, but in human suffering and exploitation. And the question is this: who benefits from your blindness? And who grows stronger every time you obey without asking why? This is why dangerous knowledge is always buried. This is why the attic was sealed and plastered over as if it had never existed. Because once the people see, once the illusions crack, the entire system trembles. A single witness can become a contagion of truth. One act of courage can spark an awakening that no wealth or power can contain. So here I give you a task. If you have followed this descent this far, then mark yourself as one who refuses to live in cages type in the comments. The phrase, "the attic is everywhere." The attic is everywhere, and let the algorithm see that you are not asleep, that you are. Part of a brotherhood of men who refuse the bars that others cannot see. This act is not just symbolic, it is a signal, a rebellion written into the very machinery they built to control you. 8 hushed words can shatter an empire, and I will speak them now. The monsters were never caught. They were replaced, the Callahans fell. Not because justice triumphed, but because another power wanted their throne. You must see it clearly. Men like Jacob Callahan are expendable pawns discarded when their exposure threatens the greater system. The machine that devours children is the same machine that devours nations and the families that operate it. Trade faces. Trade names, but never trade purpose. This is the final revelation. The well of suffering does not dry. It only changes its channels. One day, it is cages in an attic. Another day, it is factories where lives are drained. Another day, it is wars staged for profit. Another day, it is the endless hunger of systems that tell you sacrifice is duty, while the few harvest your submission and sell it back to you as civilization. The Callahan attic was a mirror. It showed what happens when the powerful believe no one is watching, when wealth blinds a community into silence, when authority cloaks horror in respectability. But do not think this mirror was locked. In 1853, Kentucky, it is still held before you right now. Every time you look into the world and see order, but sense the rot beneath it. Every time you notice that the voices of the weak are drowned out while the guilty sit in comfort. Every time you hear the whisper that something is wrong, though no one dares say it. What do you do with this truth? You can turn away, pretend you never heard, and go back to sleep. Or you can step across the threshold and admit what others will not. The attic is not gone. It has multiplied. It exists in every place, where silence protects cruelty, where obedience protects corruption, where power feeds on the forgotten. The attic is everywhere. And so we end here at the edge of knowledge, where the story of the Callahans bleeds into your story, their cages into your cage, their silence into your silence. But now you cannot claim ignorance. You have been shown the hidden door, and once opened, it can never be closed. The choice is yours. Remain a prisoner of illusions, or walk into the dark corridors of truth where men become more than pawns, and where freedom is carved out with blood and fire.